Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we're going to be discussing the case of 3 family members who were murdered in their own home. Due to the difficulty authorities had with nailing down a motive, they found themselves in a dubious position. Both everyone and no one was a suspect. However, with one key piece of evidence left at the scene, authorities believe they are on the brink of bringing this killer to justice, but still need the public's help to close this case, nearly 30 years later. Today's case is about the murders of Mary, Thomas, and David Johnson. The Johnson family consisted of parents Mary and Thomas and their 3 sons, David, the oldest, and then his brothers Keith and Eddie. The family was well known in the town of Clifton, South Carolina, which was located in Spartanburg County and was described as a quaint little mill village. Clifton was said to be a very tight-knit community, and based on my research, the area seemed to be more heavily populated by elderly and retired folks. And by all accounts, the Johnsons appeared to fit right in and were a very well-liked family that got along with everyone. Thomas and Mary Johnson owned a home located at 270 Cedar Street in Clifton, and they'd owned this property for over 30 years by the time the story begins in 1993. Also, me just being me, of course, looked up the Johnsons' property on Cedar Street, and it seems, at least today in 2022, to be located in a quiet and overall pretty normal-looking neighborhood. The Johnsons' house in particular was kind of nestled within some trees, but it's definitely not entirely secluded, and there appear to be a fair few houses around.
Was there easy access to highways in the area?
It didn't really look like it. It's like very secluded and...
Rural?
Yeah, rural is a better word. Like the neighborhood just felt like there were just so many trees around. Like when you look at the overhead view of it,
yeah.
It's not like rural in the sense of like farmland, but it's not even so much the suburbs. Like it's definitely like this small little tiny little town. But no, I would say not super close to the highways.
All right.
Now, in terms of what the Johnsons did for a living, both Mary and Thomas used to work at a place in town called the Clifton Mill No. 2, hence Clifton and Spartanburg being known as mill villages. The couple had worked there for many years, but prior to their deaths in 1993, they'd retired from their mill jobs, and Clifton Mill No. 2 actually no longer exists today.
Do you have a picture of this family?
Yes, I do. I'll send it to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so when I look at this family, I know you said it's 93.
Yeah.
But it's not like 93 for you and I. I mean, 93 for you, you wouldn't even remember, really.
Yeah, exactly.
But when I was young, all of my older relatives looked like this family.
Yes, we've definitely talked about this before. How it was like all of your relatives, regardless of their age, all looked like
way older than what they were.
Exponentially older than what they were, yeah. And I think we said it's the haircut.
Yes, it's the haircut. It's also like the color palettes of their clothing.
Definitely, yep.
The way the photos were taken, the lighting and stuff like that. Not that we're from like the same area, but I vibe with this family.
Kind of reminds you of your own.
My relatives were.
Yeah,
right.
Definitely. Now, sometime in the late 70s or early 80s, tragedy struck the Johnson family when their son, Eddie, was killed in a car accident. Eddie's death obviously had an impact on the entire family, but seemed to particularly affect the eldest of the 3 boys, David. He was said to have previously been a pretty talented athlete during his teen years, and was even considered to have been a football star during his time in high school. And as David grew older, he wound up getting a relatively stable job at what was said to be a steel products company located in the Spartanburg area. However, after losing his younger brother, it really took a toll on him, and he seemed to have done a complete 180 in terms of his mental health, and from what I can tell, he left that job and was unable to continue working. I've seen it reported that David was either disabled or mentally ill, like those were the specific terms that were used to describe him. But of course, there obviously could have been more going on with him that I'm not privy to, but what I do know is that overall, he struggled with his mental health.
After the death of his brother.
Correct, yes. And according to reporting done in a publication entitled The State, it was said that David's mental health was, quote, controlled by medication. And then that same article stated that David, quote, never moved away from home and was unable to work or drive, end quote. And at the time our story begins, in January of 1993, David was 43 years old and was still living at home with his parents.
Did he move out from his parents' home and then move back after his brother died, or was he forever living with them?
That I'm not entirely sure of. I couldn't quite nail it down. I have a feeling he might not have ever left, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
All right.
So not only was David wrestling with his mental health, but both his mother, Mary, who was 77 at the time, and his father, Thomas, who was 81, were battling health conditions themselves. From what I can tell, Thomas seemed to be in the poorest of health of the three, and Mary appeared to have spent a lot of her time taking care of both her husband and her son. It's been reported that each family member took a multitude of medications on a daily basis, but it's unclear exactly what type of medications they each took or what conditions Mary and Thomas Johnson were dealing with specifically. But thankfully, Mary wasn't completely alone in her caretaking of her husband and son because Keith Johnson, her other son, lived nearby with his wife Elizabeth, and they would both come to the Johnsons' home relatively often to assist with anything they may need due to their struggles with their health.
Do we know anything about the dynamic between David and Eddie prior to Eddie's death?
No, I don't. This was one of those cases where it was like not very reported on. Like there weren't even really people talking on forums or Facebook or things like that where it's like I could kind of try and gather like people who said they knew them, maybe some comments that they made. I really don't know a lot about their life other than pretty much what I've told you.
Right. And if you're also, investigating what I assume are the potential deaths or murders of Mary, Thomas, and David, those articles may not really go into, life earlier on with the brothers and stuff like that. So I understand that. But what kind of popped into my head is, obviously brothers are going to have a tight-knit relationship. But what could have happened, or what type of link did David have to Eddie to have such a drastic change in his mental health? If that was like the spark that lit the fire that sent him on like a downward spiral.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Could he have, told Eddie that he was going to pick him up somewhere and he didn't? And then
maybe
Eddie
he
went
felt
with
like it was
somebody
his
else.
own fault or
right.
something
Could there
like
be
that.
some type of tie there? May not go into this investigation, but just had me thinking about,
what their
relationship
dynamic was. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so now to kind of just dive into the timeline of events of this case, on Friday, January 8th, 1993, a local hairdresser by the name of Maddie Thornton was awaiting a call from her friend and client of over 20 years, Mary Johnson. She was waiting for Mary's usual Friday evening call to set a time for the following morning to get her hair done. And according to reporting done for the Greenville News, Mary Johnson's normal scheduling process for her hair appointments was that she'd call Maddie up on Friday nights, I assume on a fairly regular basis, and she'd make an appointment for the following morning. So it seems to me that she did her hair probably every week or every couple of weeks, and this Friday night phone call was something that Maddie would have expected. However, on that particular Friday night, Maddie never received a call from Mary, which was definitely out of the ordinary, but not a cause for concern at that point. Then, the following morning, Saturday, January 9th, Mary didn't show up to get her hair done and still hadn't contacted Maddie. With a pit beginning to form in her stomach, Maddie attempted to call the Johnson residence to hopefully reach her friend, but no one answered the phone.
Now, I could see a lot of people looking at this and being like, really? Why is she so hard up on this lady not calling for the haircut or, not showing up?
I see what you're saying, but I'm sure I'm going to agree with what you're going to say.
Right. We're talking about a super tight-knit community. These people know each other on a friend basis, not necessarily a service basis, like, I go to get my haircut here. This has probably been a relationship that's built over years, if not decades. And when you have a pattern set forward of, this is when she always calls, this is when she comes in, and that doesn't happen, and then you can't get in touch with her.
Obviously, you're like, okay,
it's like a family friend being
Yes.
concerned of somebody not showing up after they were supposed to.
And I feel like a lot of times, at least back in the day, I say back in the day, I know it's 30 years, it's a long time. So I just feel like older women had this very strict, like they would go and they would get their hair cut and they would get it permed or curled or whatever it is, like very, very regularly. And to like not do that.
Well, with the haircut that they had to do it regularly to keep it looking so round.
Coiffed.
Coiffed, yes,
Coiffed
indeed.
is the word that comes to mind. But yeah, exactly. So I can totally see what you're saying. I think people looking at it now, if it were 2022 when this is happening, they'd be like, well, that's a little weird, but definitely different mindset, different times.
Yeah.
Makes sense that she's concerned. I didn't even bat an eye at that. I was like, oh, I can totally see why she's like calling up, trying to find her friend.
Right.
Now, what happens next is a little bit wishy-washy in terms of details, but I've seen it reported that someone that was described as a relative, which I assume means a relative of the Johnsons, called Maddie, the hairdresser, sometime during the day on that Saturday, the 9th. Apparently, this family member was unable to get in contact with Mary, Thomas, or David, and they were starting to get worried as this was out of the ordinary for them. One can assume that this family member likely knew Mary's normal routine and probably figured since it was Saturday that she might just be at her hair appointment, and by calling Maddie, in turn, this person might be able to then reach Mary. And honestly, if I had to guess if this account of what took place is accurate, I'd think the relative that phoned Maddie could have potentially been Elizabeth Johnson, the daughter-in-law of Mary and Thomas, or if not her, it could have also possibly been her husband that called, which would have been the Johnsons' other son, Keith. But the reason that I say that I think it could have been Elizabeth that called is because she actually ends up getting together with Maddie later on that Saturday night to go and check on Mary, Thomas, and David.
Right, so you can imagine that she calls Maddie. Maddie also shares her concern that they can't get in touch with them. Okay, let's meet up. Just in case something happened,
yeah,
we'll go there together.
Makes perfect
sense. And we'll
sense.
see if we can find them.
Yep, exactly. So from there, around 7 p.m. that night on January 9th, 1993, Maddie and Elizabeth traveled to the Johnsons' home and repeatedly knocked on the door but received no answer. Now, since Elizabeth and Keith lived nearby and came by often to help take care of the family, Elizabeth had a key to the house, so she went ahead and used it to unlock the door to get inside to check on them. And when Maddie and Elizabeth walked into that house, they were met with a horrific scene. Authorities with the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office were called immediately and were dispatched to 270 Cedar Street, and they would continue to be the lead agency working on this investigation. Upon police's arrival, they discovered that all 3 residents of the home, Mary, Thomas, and David, were all dead, and all 3 of their bodies were found together in the same room of the house, which was said to be the front downstairs bedroom. And it was later released that they were all found on the exact same bed in that room as well.
I already get the vibe of some type of assisted suicide pact or something like that. I don't know. It's just what immediately caught me. Like, they're all in the same bed. They're all in the front bedroom of the house. They're all laying in it together. They're all dead. It's weird.
You're not like on the wrong track, mainly because you don't know enough about the situation yet, which I think you will change your mind as we keep going, but there's more to it that I think you're gonna understand basically from like what the locals think.
All right.
Now, something interesting that I found later reported in this case that I wanted to bring up now is that all 3 of the Johnsons slept in the same bedroom. And from what I've gathered, it was this particular bedroom where their bodies were found that they all slept in together. I don't know exactly why they all shared this room because based on public record, it appears to me that there were 3 bedrooms in this house. However, I can assume that maybe it was just easier for Mary to take care of her husband and son this way, with them all residing in the same bedroom together. And I think that could be the case as well because there is the potential that the other bedrooms might have just been upstairs, and for all we know, it could have been difficult for them to go up and downstairs. I'm not exactly sure. I am just assuming, but that's like my best guess on it.
No, well, that totally makes sense. I mean, you hear about a lot of people as they get older and they want to downsize their house. They want to downsize to one floor because they don't want to travel the stairs.
Exactly. And you have to think 77 and 81, that's getting up there in age.
Yeah. And also, too, to your point about how it's easier for Mary to take care of everybody in there. Mm-hmm. If they're all sleeping in the same room, if something happens, it's not going to go unnoticed as easily as it would if
someone were in a different space.
They were all in different spaces, right?
Yeah, I agree completely. But regardless of the specific sleeping arrangements of the Johnson family, it was first reported that authorities were unsure if this scene that they'd walked in on was a triple homicide or potentially even a double murder-suicide. So, John, I can kind of see, why you would have thought that. It seems like that's initially police are kind of thinking almost the same thing.
I mean, that's going to be the first thing that pops into my head. I would assume that's the first thing that pops into a lot of people's head. Mm-hmm. Because you haven't said anything about injuries yet.
No.
So if you have 3 family members all dead laying in the same bed and they weren't shot, stabbed, strangled, and then placed there, like ritualistically or something after the fact.
Yep.
What else are you to believe?
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying, but we are going to dive into that in just a little bit. Now, there was a lot of conjecture in the early days of this case, and that was mostly due to the fact that authorities hadn't yet determined if this was a triple murder or a murder-suicide. But a lot of people seemed to wonder right off the bat if this had something to do with David's mental health struggles, and it was speculated by locals that he could have potentially killed his parents and then killed himself. The autopsies for all three of the deceased were scheduled for Sunday, January 10th, 1993, which would hopefully clear things up a bit more. And the ME was, in fact, able to determine a more concrete answer to the question of whether this was a triple murder or a murder-suicide. And after the autopsies had been completed, within a day or so, authorities did release to the public the information that was gathered by the ME and let everyone know that this was, in fact, a triple murder, and that all three of the Johnsons had been killed by somebody else. During the very early stages of this investigation, there were surprisingly quite a few tidbits of info that were discussed and released by authorities. There wasn't a ton of detail about these bits of information per se, but I think each thing that they decided to release can help to answer some questions, but also kind of creates a bunch more. So we're going to get into that right now. So first of all, it was released that all three of the Johnsons were killed by multiple stab wounds. And it was mentioned that a part of the reason why the idea of a murder-suicide was ruled out was because of the way in which they were all killed. And within a few days of the murders, the chief coroner's investigator at the time stated, quote, "I can say they all died within a short period of time of each other and that they were stabbed with a knife," end quote.
So was this a bloody scene, and you just haven't told me that yet?
From what I understand, yes, but more so confined to one space.
Okay. So if I had known that when Maddie and Elizabeth showed up, that it was a bloody scene, I don't think I would have gone down that route of murder, suicide, stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying there, but...
Which is kind of why I made the comment about where they killed somewhere else and then placed there after the fact.
Yeah, so these are all things that we're probably going to be questioning, like, as we continue going on with this, but in one respect, I guess I find it interesting that you also kind of came to like a conclusion that locals did at first. So it's like when you don't have a ton of information, what are you going to instantly think? And you were kind of along the same lines of what everybody else was thinking. They didn't know. All they knew was, we're living in this neighborhood. Police are called. 3 people are dead. We know nothing else. And
they were all found in the same bed in the bedroom.
Yeah. So like, what is everybody going to think? They're going to think the same thing you just did.
Right. Because, and I don't think it's wrong to think that, because we talk about Occam's razor a lot of times, where in lieu of additional evidence, the most simple answer is the easiest. And if they're all dead in the same bed nearby to each other, and that information about them being stabbed to death is not out in the public, then, okay, you would have to assume that if there's no struggle, they're all laying dead next to each other.
Yeah, and nobody would have known otherwise, unless obviously Maddie and Elizabeth sent anything. But I'm sure police were like, please don't talk to people about this.
Right.
So the rumors, the things that people were saying, I mean, it's as much as it sucks for people to like just say things and talk about stuff and create these rumors that obviously are not true at this point. It's kind of just human nature.
Right.
And I can see why people would have believed that. So
yeah,
it's interesting that you were the exact same way.
Right.
But I will say, the thing that just like blows my mind about this, which also came out after the autopsies were completed, is that Mary, Thomas, and David had all died literally within minutes of each other. How could someone subdue 3 grown adults and kill them all within minutes of each other? Obviously, I know they were all struggling with health issues, but 3 against 1 seems like pretty tough odds if you ask me.
I mean, if it's a fit adult that is our suspect, you take David out of the equation first, then you're dealing with a 77-year-old lady that's not in the best health, and an 81-year-old man that's in the worst health of the 3 of them.
Yeah. I don't know. I have this like weird feeling in my belly that like maybe there could have been more than one person here, because...
Also to move all those people onto the same bed, because...
Yeah.
We can assume that they were in the same room, but they probably weren't laying in the same bed together, and then they were placed there after.
Yes, that's what I would assume, and there's a little bit more about that would probably lead you to that as well.
All right.
Now, in terms of the murder weapon, from what I can tell, it doesn't appear as though it had been found because there were a few mentions in the press that investigators were searching the nearby area for the potential murder weapon. But just based on that comment I mentioned a few minutes ago from the chief coroner's investigator, it does seem like authorities at least knew what the weapon was, even though they hadn't recovered it.
If you think it's stab wounds, you'd assume some type of knife or blade.
I mean, you could probably stab people with a multitude of things.
I suppose.
A pencil.
What are you, John Wick?
No, but I'm just thinking there's probably other types of weapons that one could use. So then it also kind of got me thinking, like, do they believe it's a knife because maybe it was like a weapon in their own home?
And it's missing?
Yeah, but that's not anything that's ever been released. It was just something that like popped into my head. Like, how would they know for sure? Really, even like before the autopsies or what? Like,
yeah, well, when you said, oh, well, it could be something else besides a knife, I was thinking back to my old relatives' freezers. And they used to have the ice box. And they used to have an ice pick to break the ice up.
Oh.
As far as like another item to stab with.
Interesting.
You know, like an ice pick or something like that.
Yeah, so I wonder then, like, if it could have been something within their own home and maybe not something that the perpetrator, like, brought with them.
Yeah.
And maybe that's how they, like, kind of nailed it down outside of whatever was discovered in the autopsies.
Yeah, I don't know. I usually feel fairly confident that I can talk freely about what I think in cases because usually, like, the evidence points one way or the other, or you can usually deduce the route that it's probably going to go.
Yeah.
But in this one, I feel like I'm not going to have a lot more to say until you give me a lot more information because it's very odd already, like with the bedroom and but then they're all stabbed to death and then they all died within minutes of each other. I mean, I would assume that there's some type of calculation where if you're stabbed in a particular area on your body, you're going to bleed out so much blood over a period of time that if you did it to 3 people in succession, they're both going to die roughly within the same amount of time. Yeah,
but again, I just think that goes into, could one person do that without, like, someone potentially being able to escape?
Do we know whose bed they were in?
I don't know that, and all I know is that it was in the bedroom that they all slept in together. That's the most detail I've gotten.
Yeah. I'm thinking, like, if a burglar broke in, or whoever was trying to murder these people, if David was in his bed and he was the first victim.
And then it was
then everybody else rushed in and they were kind of, struggling to fight against the perpetrator.
Yeah.
They're all near that bed.
Well, there's a little more, so.
All right.
Something else that was stated by authorities pretty early on was that there did appear to be some semblance of a struggle in the house. However, it wasn't said exactly what was found in the house to indicate that or really any other specific details about it. But one thing that investigators did say was that things in the house weren't exactly as they should be. Now, again, that's not a whole lot of detail, but I guess it gives a little bit more insight into what they'd seen within the home. And it was also confirmed much later on in this case that authorities' belief that there was a struggle not only consisted of the fact that things were out of place, but also because each of the Johnsons had suffered broken ribs, and those injuries were uncovered during their autopsies. It was also confirmed that there was no sign of forced entry to the house, so that could lead you to believe that the Johnsons may have known their killer or let them in willingly. Or something I'm going to bring up later is maybe they just left their doors unlocked because this community was definitely one where people just felt safe, they felt comfortable, and they didn't always lock their doors.
I mean, even though it's 93, this wouldn't be the first time that we've heard of people leaving their doors unlocked.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think that kind of like leaves it a little bit open-ended. Like if they just left their doors unlocked, this could have totally been a stranger. Or if they were the type to lock their doors, then you would assume that it's more than likely someone that they knew.
Right.
So
I wonder what that
again, more questions.
Answer is, though.
Yeah, that's what I'd like to know.
Did they always lock their door at night or did they not?
I don't know, unfortunately.
Did we get a rough time of death?
We're getting there.
All right.
Now, not only did police find that there was this struggle within the house with no signs of forced entry, but they also came across blood in other rooms of the house, not just the bedroom where the bodies were located. It was said that the additional blood was found in the kitchen as well as the living room, and more specifically, within the living room, blood was seen on a chair as well as near the phone that was located in that room. And finally, it was believed by authorities that all 3 of the Johnsons had been deceased since that Saturday morning, January 9th. However, I will say, over time, it's confirmed that the mindset on the time of death seemed to shift a little bit. and that it was possible that the three could have been killed Friday night, January 8th at the earliest, and then the very latest would have been the Saturday morning on the 9th. And what's interesting about this is that it was reported later that the three were last seen alive sometime on Friday, but it's unclear exactly what time that last sighting was or who it was that saw them.
So you'd have to assume that with those two conflicting reports, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Either late Friday night or early Saturday morning.
Yes.
I don't think it would have happened, 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning on Saturday.
Yeah, I agree.
It's a small, tight-knit community. People are probably home from work on Saturday mornings. It's way easier to get caught, committing a crime in a neighborhood at that time than it would be with the cover of darkness.
Yeah, and you have to think, too, older folks usually tend to wake up earlier.
Right.
And go to bed earlier. I mean, not everyone, obviously, but, it's not like
It's a generalization that is true, though.
Yeah, it's not like a college town where, everyone's up until 3 o'clock in the morning or something. You have people who...
Right, you're probably in bed by 9 o'clock. Up by 6 or 7.
Yeah, exactly. So it's probably within that window, right. I would assume.
Late Friday, early Saturday.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Something else interesting that was stated was that Mary's younger brother was actually supposed to drive her to the grocery store that Friday night, but he ended up stating that she got a ride from somebody else. I have no clue who that someone else was, though, and what's weird to me and what I questioned about this was why Mary would have needed a ride in general. I know before I had mentioned that David was unable to drive, but I don't know if Mary couldn't, if Thomas couldn't, if they didn't have a car, or what. But these are all questions that I have with zero answers.
I mean, I would have to assume that she drove because if she calls Maddie on Friday nights to make her appointment for Saturday morning.
I mean, maybe her brother always took her. I don't know.
Well, also, what time did she usually call Maddie by on Friday night?
That I'm not sure. I think at the latest early evening, if I had to guess.
Well, if she never made the phone call by early evening or whatever time she usually calls Maddie, she could have been dead by then.
That's true.
Just trying to nail down the timeline of, time of death.
But that's just so wild to think, on a Friday night at, dinner time.
Yeah. It's just odd that you know that she was supposed to make this phone call. She did it all the time on Friday nights.
Yep.
Or whenever Friday night prior to her
appointment date, yeah.
And there was no word of Maddie, trying to get in touch with whoever brings Mary.
Yeah.
So you would assume
she probably
Mary calls
drives.
Maddie, makes the appointment, and then drives, yeah. It's odd. Maybe it was, maybe she only drove short distances. That's a thing.
That is a thing, yeah.
So if the supermarket was somewhere else, or maybe help with carrying the groceries and stuff too.
Could be.
She was getting up in age. This was her younger brother that would bring her to the supermarket.
Yep.
So.
I don't know. Yeah, I just thought it was interesting. Something to make note of. Yeah.
There's a lot in there that
can go along with the timeline.
Yeah, they can help you with the timeline, but also if her younger brother was the one that brought her everywhere.
Yeah.
Maddie didn't try to reach out to her younger brother.
No.
So.
Yeah, it's just strange.
It's
definitely a weird thing. Now, in terms of the initial investigation by the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office, one of the biggest hindrances was the fact that authorities seemed to be at a complete loss for what the motive was for killing the Johnsons. And during this time, you can likely assume that locals were absolutely freaking out over the fact that there was just a triple murder that happened within their community with seemingly no motive, and they were likely afraid that they were going to be targeted too. Pretty early on, though, it was released by investigators that the Johnson family murders were considered an isolated incident, and that residents of the surrounding areas did not need to be worried. And I also saw it reported that authorities weren't planning to add additional officers to patrol the area any more than they normally would, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I find it interesting. I mean, I guess if they're going to have the officers that are patrolling that area have that general neighborhood under a microscope.
Yeah.
Okay, but they're not adding any more. But
I wonder if they didn't have enough officers to warrant doing that.
I don't know. I want to know why they deemed it an isolated incident so quickly.
I wanted to know that as well.
It doesn't seem like they were wealthy.
Nope.
They were two elderly individuals with a disabled son. I would like to know the extent of his disability.
Yeah, it seems like everything about him and most of the talk about him was that he suffered with his mental health. He was having mental health struggles, but not...
So I'm thinking that he could still function on a daily basis, to an acceptable social standard.
Maybe that's what they mean by controlled by medication.
Right. And I would like to gather more information on the relationship to his brother that was killed in that car accident.
Yeah.
And is there anything around there, we're going out on a limb in that respect. That's something that could really be ruled out very quickly. But what was going on with Eddie? Was it really just a car accident? If it was, okay, it's ruled just a car accident. No other malintent behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Did David feel as though he was responsible because he was supposed to pick his brother up or bring him or something there? But if there was something greater, did somebody that was involved in Eddie's death fear that David would say something?
I see where you're getting at. So then maybe that's why they're like,
That's
this
like
is an
huge
isolated incident.
Right, but that's like a huge conspiracy that I'm really like, I don't like bringing something up without like fact bases on it and stuff. But if we don't have a motive and we know that David's mental health took a steep decline right after the death of his brother, could there be some type of connection between the two? Yeah,
and you have to think it has to affect him. Obviously, like, grief affects people in different ways and people get through it in different ways. But for him to literally do a complete 180, like, he was said to be a football star. Like, he seemed to be like so well liked and popular and fun and friendly and an athlete and all these things. And then for him to, you know, not be able to work, not be able to drive, live at home with his parents, like, he couldn't function as he did before, this would have to have had such a profound effect on him.
Right. It feels as though there may be more there.
Yeah, I agree. But anyway, it was said that this type of crime was entirely uncommon in this area, and that's most likely why people were terrified. However, in 1993, there were reports that there were quite a few serious crimes that had taken place in Spartanburg County so far that year. And according to an article in the Greenville News, there were already double the amount of homicides in 93 than there were the entire previous year in 92. And remember, it's literally only January at this point. So yeah, it's out of the ordinary, and that seems to be accurate. But also, it appears as though 93 was shaping up to be a particularly violent year, at least in Spartanburg County. But I will say, there was said to be 3 murders so far that year prior to the Johnsons' murders. So then having a triple murder happen obviously doubled those numbers, therefore probably making the stats look a lot higher. Even so, I can completely understand why locals didn't take that comment by police of it being an isolated incident as any sort of reassurance of their safety.
Right, it's like the reckoning has come.
Yeah.
You know, we didn't have any crime for so long, or no violent crime like this where people are getting murdered, and then all of a sudden it's January and we already have 6 people dead.
Exactly, like, that's insane.
Yeah, I'd be shitting my pants.
Yeah, for sure. And there were actually quite a few pieces done on the panic that this caused in the small, tight-knit community of Clifton, South Carolina. The Johnsons' brutal murders absolutely stunned residents living in town, and the consensus seemed to be that most were shocked that these people in particular were the ones that were killed. They were described as kind and quiet and just didn't seem to have a problem with anyone. One man named Ken Coggins was interviewed, and he was actually the minister of music at the same Baptist church the Johnsons went to, and he told the state, quote, "They never bothered anyone. They were too old to bother anyone. They were just good people," end quote. Also, according to an article with the Spartanburg Herald-Journal, another person that knew the Johnson family, and more specifically Mary, stated, quote, "Mary was one of the most godly women I've ever known. She was from the generation that had stickability," end quote.
Stickability?
Yeah, I was like, what on earth does that mean? I had never heard that term before.
Did you look it up?
I did, yeah.
I'm thinking, like, if you have stickability, you're reliable.
Pretty much, yeah. It says a person's ability to persevere with something or staying power.
Yeah.
So, like, she was, I would assume, devout.
Yeah, well, I mean, she's the caretaker for her adult son and her husband, and she goes to church all the time. And
she had this regular schedule with her hair. I mean, she seems like a very, like, on-the-ball person.
I would say my mom is stickable.
Yes, I agree completely. For sure.
Now, do you think that they were targeted because they seemed like they were an easy target?
That I'm not entirely sure of. And I think it just, like, goes into trying to nail down the motive.
Right.
And that's, like, the hardest part for me. Obviously, these other murders that had happened weren't in any way connected. I think one person had been strangled in their car or something. I can't remember for sure, but none of them had similarities to say, like, they were connected. But I will say, like, they do seem like they could have been vulnerable in that way, depending on what the individual's motive was in terms of targeting people. Like, if they were targeting someone for a certain reason, if it had anything to do with vulnerability, knowing that they didn't lock their doors or something like that. Like, say they watched them, or maybe they knew, David didn't leave the house. He was struggling with his mental health. Maybe they knew
Thomas was old and feeble.
And that he was really struggling with his health. It was said that he was in the poorest health of all of them. So, I mean, maybe it has something to go along with that. But I think at the end of the day, it's like, if you knew the motive, maybe you could nail that down a little bit better.
I think oftentimes with unsolved cases, not having a motive is usually the biggest roadblock in being able to solve a case.
100%. We talked about it in Roland and Maram Hanel.
Right. Outside of, poor police work or lack of communication between agencies that are working, there are other factors that make it difficult to solve a case. But when you don't have a motive...
What are you working off of?
Right.
Nothing. You're literally working out of thin air.
Your best bet would be to see if you can get the FBI involved, and based on the deaths, how they were killed, the state of the house at the time, can they create some type of profile?
Yeah, and that brings me right back to Roland and Maram Hanel, where they put out this profile, and, they expressed that they felt as though it was someone within the community and all these other things. That was the one where they had like an overbearing female in their life and that whole situation.
Right.
So
and the land dispute.
Yeah, so I just wonder if they had, and I don't know if they have, maybe they have this like in their back pocket and they're working with a profile that nobody else is privy to, but for them to potentially have that to like look within their community and say like, oh, was it someone passing through, or was it someone who is like practically your next door neighbor? Who knows? But I think those things could all be very helpful if you don't have a motive.
Did they have anything valuable that was missing from the house?
Not that I am aware of, no.
Except potentially maybe a murder weapon was taken, but there were no, rings or money or
No, it didn't
else.
seem like motive would have been robbery at all. And spoiler alert, I'll tell you now, but robbery is ruled out later on.
Okay.
So that would have been like my first thought. Is like, that's where I'm going to go. If there's this struggle, what does that mean? Did like people rummage through the house, try and take things? That doesn't seem to be what happened here at all. Again,
that makes it that much more difficult because what's the motive?
Exactly.
Are those other murders unsolved?
I honestly don't know. They never said like their names. It was just like, oh, there was a this crime in whatever, and there was a this crime in, this person was killed in their house. This person was killed in a car. This person was found in the woods or something. Like, no one ever said like any of the names.
Odd.
Yeah. It was like a fleeting mention. That's what I'm saying. Like, I do not have a lot of sources on this case because it was not heavily publicized. And if it was, then it's in publications that I have no access to.
Yeah.
But it's just wild to me. Like, I was literally pulling teeny tiny little tidbits from like every single publication. If like something was slightly different in one, it was like, all right, that could mean something. Or did someone have a police source? Or did someone talk to someone who said this? Like, trying to like piece all of it together. But this was a tough one to get info on for sure.
Yeah, it seems that way. And it's not like Molly Bish, who they have a connection to, or a believed connection to, Holly Peranian.
Yes.
So it's not like these other murders that happened in the same area. Why even mention them in the article if you're not going to try and make a connection there?
I don't even think it was mentioned to even try and make a connection. I think it was discussed just to say...
a passing by thing of how there's an uptick in violent crime.
Yeah, and it goes along with what we're about to dive into now, which has to do with like how this all affected the community and how the fact that there was so much violent crime, like what all these people were thinking, how they're kind of changing the way they're living their lives and all of that. I've seen a lot of comments describing the fact that people living there never lock their doors. We were talking about that before. We're not sure if the Johnsons were like that, but there was also like not even street lights on this like quaint little road that they all lived on. But after this happened, individuals were completely changing their habits and they were planning to install street lights for a better sense of safety. One neighbor that lived on Cedar Street that was interviewed stated, quote, "There's a lot of lights being left on around here at night now," end quote. And another neighbor stated, quote, "I'm scared now. I really am. I want them, investigators, hot on the trail. Each minute that passes, the trail gets cold. I want them to hurry up and get something done," end quote.
It's crazy to imagine that street not having any street lights on it. Because obviously we have like all the lights around our house.
Yeah.
But then when that street light goes out in front of the house,
it's instantly so dark.
Yes, it's like pitch black except for where our lights reach. And it's like instantly noticeable too.
Oh, absolutely. Like you look out
and
you're
pitch
like,
black.
is there someone standing outside staring into my house? I don't know, because I can't freaking see them. So I can totally see why they'd be freaked right out. I just think about, like, if it were me, I'd be terrified too. Like, I can completely understand why all of these people were terrified, why they wanted police to do more. And I remember reading a lot too about how they were all saying, like, no one's giving us info. They're just saying, like, oh yeah, you're safe. Like, oh yeah, it's an isolated incident. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's that. Like, you have nothing to worry about. But they weren't giving any details. They have no motive. They have no information.
Right. I mean, I'd be the next one. I'd be like, well, am I going to be the next isolated incident?
Exactly. I'd be like, can I come help you? Like, can I help solve this? Because what the fuck? Like, right. I'm terrified right now.
Yeah.
So I get it.
The unknown makes it that much worse.
100%. So pretty early on, a man by the name of Mike Little, who was a spokesman for the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office, stated, quote, "We've been canvassing the area, speaking with neighbors, friends, and associates. We've come up with some information, but I can't get into what we've found out," end quote. And the canvassing of the area seemed to be particularly important because you'd have to assume that in a community such as this one, someone definitely could have seen something, heard something, or maybe even overheard someone talking about it. And without witnesses coming forward with anything they knew or potentially even saw, it would likely make it a lot more difficult to solve this crime. Now, at this point, I do want to fast forward a little bit to about a week and a half after the murders, and something that could be incredibly helpful to this investigation and possibly even link another person to the crime scene was released to the public. This, I feel like, was the first big thing that could, like, hopefully give answers in some way.
Right, if you can tie somebody to the crime scene.
Yeah.
That's huge.
So it's reported that there was a piece of evidence that was left in the home that authorities believed may have belonged to the Johnsons' killer. And that item was a hat.
So, just another thing that had popped into my head.
Mm-hmm.
After the suspect murdered the Johnsons, could he have moved them, or could they have moved them off to the one bed to be able to search, clean up, make sure they didn't leave anything behind? Couldn't find the hat for whatever reason, and they were just like, oh, I got to get out before somebody finds me.
I mean, that's definitely possible.
I'm just still weirded out that they were all on the same bed.
Yeah, and now we know that there was blood in the kitchen, there was blood in the living room, but we don't know how much blood. We don't know if they could have been killed in this location and then moved. That's something that we're not aware of.
Right.
So back to the hat. The hat was said to be a Detroit Pistons baseball-style cap, and it was found in the same bedroom where Mary, Thomas, and David's bodies were found. The details of what the hat looked like were reported in a piece in the Greenville News, and the description is as follows. Quote, "The well-worn Pistons cap is black or dark blue. The letters are orange and blue. The cap also has a National Basketball Association label on it. Little said investigators do not think any of the Johnsons wore the hat," end quote.
DNA, baby.
Well, authorities were, of course, testing this hat for any probably important evidence, including prints or blood that may have been on it. And like you just said, John, I assume DNA, but that was not reported publicly. So I'm not sure if they were, but you would have to assume they probably were testing for DNA.
Right. I mean, and you have to assume that they got something. It's a well-worn hat.
Mm-hmm.
It's
sweat DNA, touch DNA.
Hair fibers.
Anything. Yeah.
Skin fibers.
Yeah.
You know, and then you think, too, well, we're in 93. DNA is not this mysterious thing that nobody knows about anymore.
Yeah. It's still in its infancy. Like we just talked in last week's episode for Amy Baker, you needed a much larger sample. That was in 89.
But if you took my baseball hat that I wear when I cut the grass, that thing is filled with my DNA.
Oh my God, so much.
You'd have a million samples to take out of that thing.
Absolutely.
So if this is a well-worn hat, I would have to assume that outside of some catastrophic event where this thing was lost or destroyed or something, they had to be able to pull something from it.
Yeah, so who knows, but within the first couple of months, it appeared as though progress was being made, with that same spokesperson for the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office stating, quote, "There has been progress from the standpoint that each time we take a look at the scene and gather some evidence, we move a little bit forward," end quote. And pretty quickly, it seemed like authorities wanted to gather as much information as they could from the only remaining relatives, at least nearby and immediate relatives. And those two would have been, you guessed it, Keith and Elizabeth Johnson. So it's reported in recent years that back in 1993, Keith and Elizabeth had been questioned extensively by police. However, I couldn't find anything reporting about that in the early days of the investigation. Like, there was nothing from like the 90s, even the early 2000s, but I have a sneaking suspicion that that has to do with the fact that I cannot find archives of the Spartanburg Herald-Journal online. But in a more recent article on the Spartanburg Herald-Journal's website, there is some discussion of the questioning of the son and daughter-in-law that took place back in 93. So according to this piece, quote, "They won't tell us nothing," Elizabeth Johnson in April 1993 said of investigators. "I think the sheriff's department let the trail get very cold messing with us. I don't have a bit of faith in them. But who knows, maybe in time they'll solve it," end quote. Police did say that they were investigating as best they could, and that did include this exhaustive questioning of Keith and his wife. And this same article does discuss authorities' comment regarding their investigation at the time, and I think kind of alludes to why they think Keith and Elizabeth may have been frustrated with them. The article states, quote, "We've tried to be as open as we can with them, but there are just things we cannot discuss with them to maintain the integrity of the case," Coffey told the Herald-Journal in 1993. "We don't give up on these cases. We never do," end quote.
So something about the hat that I was thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
You'll generally never see me wearing a sports team's hat.
No, me either.
I play sports. I enjoy sports, but I don't follow them.
Yeah, thank God, truly, because if I had to deal with Sunday football, whew, yeah. I would not be enjoying that.
I know, I get shunned at work. People are like, "You don't watch football?" I'm like, "I'll watch it. I just don't follow it."
I have the best husband. We watch House of the Dragon on Sundays.
But you have a Detroit Pistons well-worn hat.
Yeah.
Generally, sports fans buy their team's hat.
Yes.
So did they ever look into people that moved to the area from Detroit? Anybody from Michigan that was kind of traveling through the area? Anybody that was involved in sports gambling?
Good. That's something good to bring up. I didn't think about that.
When you think of crime, like money usually goes hand in hand with crime.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not in this instance.
Yeah.
But when you have a sports team's hat there, it looks like it's well worn. This person's probably had that hat for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
If it does belong to a suspect, were they from the area? Just trying to come up with something that may not have been thought about.
Yeah. But you have to think, too, like Michigan to South Carolina.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, this wasn't a South Carolina or North Carolina team.
No.
Right. So
were they originally from there and were like transplants to South Carolina, or was this, like we were talking about before, like someone passing through?
Right. Did you look into this Detroit angle?
I would hope so.
I would hope so as well. But just trying to come up with ideas where they may not have been looked into as intensely as maybe they should have, or maybe just fell through the cracks because, like Elizabeth said, she feels like
they focused too much on them.
Yeah, it could have went so cold because they wasted too much time on them when they had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, well,
potentially.
So that's the thing. Like, I can't fault police for looking at family because a lot of times they're looking into next of kin. They're looking into a spouse. Like,
right.
That makes sense to me.
And you could, if you were like, a detective that had your eye set on this family member, on Keith and Elizabeth, and you know that Keith and Elizabeth were always getting called to have to come help their elderly parents and in-laws and help his mentally ill brother. It's like, oh, you were tired of doing that, weren't you? You were getting annoyed with that. You just couldn't handle it anymore. You wanted to live your own life, but you kept getting pulled back to have to stay with them and to have to help them. You killed them, didn't you?
Yeah, and I can see that being a total tactic used by police.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to mention, too, is something that actually Janice, shout out Janice if you're listening, she brought up to me before, and it has to do with the person that finds somebody's body or reports somebody missing, or whoever is like there at the scene right when it happens or right after it happens, and they're the ones calling 911. A lot of times it's supposedly potentially that person. And I don't know like how accurate that potential statistic is, or like if police see that like whoever is the one that's calling or rolling up on the scene, like finding somebody deceased, has some sort of involvement. So I wonder if they were questioning them more because Elizabeth was one of the individuals that found the Johnsons in the house.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have never thought of that as like a strong indicator.
Yeah, see, I never did either. So I was like, is that
no, because
like
you want
to,
I mean, perhaps if you're going there with somebody else so you can share in that moment and be like grief stricken.
Yeah.
Because then it's like, no, I didn't do this. I was also with this other person.
Yeah.
And you could kind of bounce it off them versus, just Elizabeth showing up on her own, then maybe, that's kind of strange, whatever. But I would never have labeled that as, like I said, an indicator.
Yeah, someone like, we need to look into them. Like,
no, I mean, you look into them, obviously, because they're right in front of you.
Yeah. You look into everyone that's right in front of you.
But I wouldn't think that more often than not, the person that reports is the person that did it. That makes no sense to me, and I don't think that's an accurate statistic.
I need to figure this out. But I will say, it does kind of seem like they were barking up the wrong tree when it came to their questioning of Keith and Elizabeth. It doesn't appear as though they ever really deeply looked into them any further. I think they probably just did this, extensive questioning early on, and from there, I think they ruled them out. It hasn't been, like, flat out stated publicly, which, because this case hasn't been, like, super publicized, I doubt it would have been. Yeah. But it does not seem to me like they had any involvement, like police believe they had any involvement, and it was probably just like, we've got nothing, so we're going to question you in the early days, and it's unfortunate, but I get it.
Yeah, something for maybe future investigators that are listening to this that may want to get into that type of work. If you have family members that are from the area, they're rooted in that area, they're not going anywhere, gather the information that you need from them. They're not going anywhere. So in the early days of an investigation, we've learned from the first 48 that, those first couple days are the most important time. So if you have somebody that is not ruled out totally yet, but they're not going anywhere, let them sit and really dive into all the other minutia of the case.
Yeah.
That could lead you to somebody else.
That might flee, that might be...
Right, and then once you have gotten all of that taken care of, you know that you can still go back to the family members that you may have had suspicions about.
Yes.
And then spend extra time on that later.
Yes, I completely agree with that. So also, within the same time frame during the first few months of the investigation into who killed Mary Thomas and David Johnson, it's released that there was a $10,000 reward for information in the case that would be given to anyone providing a tip that would lead to the arrest and conviction of whoever killed them. And the reward was raised by Crime Stoppers of Spartanburg, the Johnson family relatives, as well as the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office. And by this time, authorities stated that they'd interviewed over 150 people in regards to the Johnsons' murders, with Sheriff Bill Coffey telling the Greenville News, quote, "We've talked to scores of people. That investigation still continues," end quote. Now, roughly 2 years would go by before there was any additional information released in this case. And by that point, authorities had practically no leads to work, and I think that had a lot to do with the fact that, again, at this stage, there was still no clue as to what the motive was. Investigators did put out, though, that they were now offering up to $50,000 to anyone that came forward with tips that could help them to close this case or any of their unsolved cases. So it's actually reported that this reward wasn't a reward for just one case in particular. It was for any that they had open at the time. But of course, that did include the Johnsons' murders.
The fact that they're putting this out, connecting it to the Johnson family murders, but saying if you give us any information on any of our cases, we'll help you out with this money. I don't know. That just struck me as weird. Yeah,
I thought it was a little strange too. So here's another thing. Authorities were also implementing a tip line that would be available to call at any time with tips and leads, but it was only going to be up and running for 30 days, which I just feel like, again, that's like something that's so strange. But also, it seems to me that the reward wasn't necessarily for an arrest or conviction in any one case because of this one particular comment I found in an article with the Greenville News. It stated, quote, "Callers can remain anonymous, and if their information leads to a break in a case, Coffey will determine how much of the $50,000 will be rewarded," end quote. So even though it was kind of left up to the sheriff to determine the amount of the reward that any tip provider might receive, the fact that the potential payout could be pretty large, investigators were obviously hoping that that would entice people to call in, even though it was like, you know, he had to determine the amount that they could potentially get from it. But
right. So sheriffs seem to have a lot more discretion in what they do and how their department runs, more so than, you know, your standard municipality and like a chief.
Yeah, it seems that way, and it's the
sheriff's also a politician.
Department.
Well, sheriffs are like voted on and put in place.
Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting, and I mean,
you would never think of like a chief being like, oh yeah, we're looking for tips. We got a pool of $50,000 here.
Yeah.
Based on what you give me, I'll decide how much I want to give you for it.
Yeah, it's like, oh, it wasn't that great. You can have $1,000.
Right.
Or it's like, oh, you close the case, have all 50.
Right.
Like, That's just wild to me to think that like someone can make that decision and like have that sort of discretion over what this tip is.
Well, I think it's because as opposed to a reward for helping solve the case, they're looking to just buy leads.
Yeah, so pretty much it's kind of what he says. So Sheriff Bill Coffey told the Anderson Independent Mail, quote, "You know, money can be a very powerful motivator, and maybe this will get them to come forward. We want that information, and we're willing to pay for it," end quote.
Exactly. So
yeah.
A lot of times rewards are for the, capture and conviction of somebody.
Yep.
But they're at such a low point in this investigation with nothing to go on.
And it seems like all of their unsolved ones, too.
They're ready to just hand out money for people to start snitching.
Yeah, exactly. That's just so wild. But also could be very useful even today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than like, oh, it's a $50,000 reward, but only if there's an arrest and a conviction. Well, what if this person who has this huge tip knows something that could close the case, but this individual's dead?
Right. The only problem with it is that you have like this one overseer of all the money dictating how they're going to divvy it out.
Exactly. So it's like, it's a double-edged sword. Like you look at it in one respect, it can be really great and really helpful for certain tips and leads. And then you also look at it in the terms of like just a reward where
and
it's
kind of corrupt in how it's paid out.
Yeah, it's just strange. And then from there, decades went by of this case being pretty much cold and barely receiving any media coverage. So now we're going to fast forward to this year, 2022. So as of January 2022, the current Spartanburg County Sheriff, Chuck Wright, gave a statement and informed the public that authorities were planning to use new technology to test evidence investigators had found at the scene back in 1993.
Advanced technology.
There's that word, baby. We're going to talk about it in every episode, it seems. Now, whatever said evidence was being reviewed and examined by SLED, aka the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. And still living relatives of Mary Thomas and David Johnson were also offering a reward of $10,000 as of 2022 for information that would lead to a conviction of the perpetrator that killed the three Johnsons. And that reward appears to be exclusive to this case compared to the one we were talking about before. Now, at this point, investigators seem pretty set on the fact that someone out there knows something about this case, and that there had to have been witnesses to this crime, or that at least maybe saw or heard something. It's also been stated that it's possible that whoever did this is still living and working among the Clifton or Spartanburg communities. Of course, that's not 100% known for certain, but it has been stated by investigators that it's definitely a possibility.
I was thinking that as you were kind of giving us that information.
Yeah.
It seems like they know that something's being covered up in the community, and somebody knows.
Like there's got to be a witness that maybe someone told them, or say they saw something weird that night and have not come forward with that information yet, that kind of thing. Right,
like maybe word got out about the Detroit Pistons hat.
Yeah.
And whoever did this, their significant other knows that, Joe used to wear Joe Schmo used to wear that when he changed the oil in the cars in the garage. But that's all he used it for, like some little thing like that where somebody in that community knows about it. And
yeah, because that's like the biggest detail that could lead anyone to a particular person in this case. There's like nothing else to say, someone saw somebody that was 6 feet tall with dark hair and whatever leaving the house at this time. Like there's nothing to identify any particular person. It's like the hat is the only thing that anyone could stick on to say, oh, Joe Schmo used to wear that, not, oh, Joe Schmo looked like that, because they don't have that.
And I think it's a very important characteristic of the hat that was laid out in that article, stating it was well worn.
Yes.
So it's not like somebody came up with this idea, they went out of town to a Walmart or a Superstore or something, bought a brand new balaclava to cover their face or some type of hat.
Yep.
This is something that the person owned and wore regularly.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so there's just a couple other things I want to give you before we can kind of dive into like theories and kind of what we're thinking here. So authorities are also of the opinion that the Johnsons more than likely knew their killer, with Sheriff Chuck Wright stating, quote, "An intruder went in, absolutely killed them. Didn't kick the door down, didn't break things. So it tells me that they knew whoever it was," end quote.
Yeah, so it makes sense that if the murders took place elsewhere in the house, but then they all were placed on this bed together, a random killer probably wouldn't do that. So maybe it was somebody they knew.
Yeah, it's a good point. However, after nearly 30 years, the motive for this crime still does not appear to have been pinned down. And like we talked about earlier, it does seem like robbery has been ruled out, and it seems like it's because there were no signs of forced entry. As the sheriff had said, like nothing was broken or, really destroyed in the house. Like you would think if someone's searching for money or valuables or things like that, maybe they would have just ransacked everything. I don't know. But it's also been stated that investigators have had suspects in the past, but could never definitively tie anyone to the murders. And it's probably because of a lack of DNA or a lack of witnesses, but that seems to be what they're working on, trying to get out of the evidence that they have and also out of the community now. Also, from what I can tell, an investigator by the name of Diane Lestage, I believe is how you pronounce her name, has recently been assigned to work the case and has been re-interviewing individuals from the area and is trying to really nail anything more down that she can now, since it's been almost 30 years since their murders. Overall, even though there is DNA that can be tested in this case, I think what authorities are trying to get at is that it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll have a concrete case to bring against anyone just with whatever physical evidence they have. So from how I'm interpreting the comments in the press on this, it seems to me that authorities want and honestly need witnesses to come forward to neatly button up this case and close it all these years later. And I think they honestly seem really confident that they're going to be able to close this case. And they had released this public statement back in January. I know it's been 9 months, but obviously DNA testing takes a long time. But I think this case is solvable. They probably just need one person to come forward and say yeah, I saw this that night. And then maybe they can tie that with whatever they get from DNA on this probably hat, because what else would they have found?
Right. They're probably looking for somebody to rule out somebody's supposed alibi.
Yeah.
Or a suspect's supposed alibi. So if they have items in the house or physical evidence in the house that can place somebody in there, they need somebody's statement to say, no, Joe Schmo left the house at 7 o'clock that night and I didn't see him until the next morning. Then it's okay, now we don't know where this guy was. Now we can push it a little harder.
Yes.
They probably have a suspect in mind that has an alibi that they can't totally deconstruct just yet.
I completely agree with that. And that is all I have in this case. I'm not going to trick you like I did last week. You thought I did because I gave you more information on the cars later on in the episode, but that is all I have. But I did want to bring up something as we kind of move into theories. And I know it might kind of contradict the whole robbery aspect, but I think there might be more to this. So I've seen a couple people mention here and there online about the Johnson's medications. And that was something that I feel from the beginning I honed in on. And I haven't really brought it up throughout this episode. I wanted to save it until you knew all the pertinent information. But I think the potential for stealing medication, or someone who might have been addicted to drugs or maybe needed money to sell drugs. I don't know what kind of medications they took. If there were heavy duty painkillers or
Oxys or something.
Yeah, or Xanax or things like that, because we know that David was struggling with his mental health, those kinds of things. I'm stuck personally on the motive maybe being something to do with the medication.
Yep.
And along those lines.
Did we know if there was medication taken though?
I don't know. That's never been stated. And it seems to me police don't really talk about the medication much. That was something that came from friends and family who told reporters David took a lot of medications. Mary and Thomas struggled with their health, so they were on medications, things like that. But I really don't, at least since the last time I looked at this case before we sat down to record, I really don't remember seeing police talk about the medications all that much.
Yeah, and I mean, that could be a quote-unquote valuable.
Exactly.
That could have been taken that may have slid under the radar.
It may not be considered a robbery, though. It would, I guess, would it?
Yeah, it would still be a robbery.
Yeah.
But I could see it going under the radar.
Mm-hmm.
You have a triple murder in a town or county that is going to hell this first month of the year. Are you really having detectives and other officers contacting the doctors to see when the last prescription was filled?
Yeah.
To see if the number of pills that were still in the house match up with when it was filled.
Yeah, so if they're taking a plethora, depending on whatever ailments they had, they could have had dozens of pill bottles for all we know.
And if you're feeling physical pain this day, you take that. If you're not, you take this. And it could have just been a huge amount that was probably far less regulated back in the day in 93.
Yeah.
Where they could have gotten, a prescription of 180 pills and just use them as you need them and come back to me when you need more.
Yeah, so it could have been something like that. Or like, I'm thinking too, if it is something to do with these medications, could this have been like a heat of the moment type of thing where they came in here, didn't expect that. Like maybe they knew the Johnsons and were like, hey, can I just get a couple pills? Like I'm really struggling or whatever. Maybe they told them no, and then things escalate. And then they also don't want to get caught because maybe people in the community know that they struggle with a drug addiction.
Yeah.
And then maybe that could lead back to them. So instead of just grabbing all the pill bottles and leaving, maybe they took individual ones. So maybe it wouldn't have been caught that these could have been taken.
Yeah. And if this is the vein that police are looking into, it also could have been, when you were saying it could have been a spur of the moment thing. This person that's known to them comes to the house. Oh, hey, can I use your bathroom? Goes into the bathroom, starts trying to take stuff, or says they're going to the bathroom, but then ducks off into the front bedroom where all the medication was, because that's where they all slept.
Yep.
And they're trying to pocket them. Mary or Thomas or David come in and they say, hey, what are you doing? And then it just all unfolds from there. That could be a possibility too.
Yeah. It coincides with someone being within the community, someone that they knew, letting them in, and then obviously like some sort of scuffle happening from there.
Yep.
But I also can't rule out, at least in my mind, like I know you were like a little wishy-washy on it earlier, but I think it is possible that it could have been more than one person.
It could have been more than one person, but to go back to what we were just talking about, where maybe this was a drug addict that, was coming down off a high or really needed the medication for whatever reason, that makes me think, again, back to the hat. If it was reported as a well-worn hat, was this thing dingy and disgusting?
Yeah.
And then you think of what goes hand in hand with drug addiction and mental illness, homelessness. Was this a well-worn hat because it was dingy and dirty and gross, because this person didn't have a lot of money because they were battling whatever it is they were going through, came here to try and get their stuff and make their way out, and then throughout the whole thing, they just, forgot about it.
Yeah. I mean, I just think leaving the hat behind.
You have to be in a sense, your mind can't be right.
Yeah, like to leave such a huge piece of evidence that will more than likely tie you to this crime in this house. Because even just, you were talking about this in the beginning, like how they kind of reminded you of your family members and things like that. Would any of those people, could you even, like in any way, shape, or form, imagine any of those people wearing a Detroit Pistons baseball cap? I feel like just looking at them,
no, they
and like
did not.
When police said like, oh, they wouldn't have worn this, I'm like, yeah, I would never imagine them to even be hat people.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I wouldn't imagine them to be basketball people if David grew up playing football.
Exactly. That's a very good point to make too. I don't know. I think the hat is such a huge thing in this case. I think the medications stick out to me. The
hat has to be the item that's going to eventually tie everything together.
Yeah, that's what's going to nail this person, I think. Right. And honestly, they're probably shaking in their boots if they're still alive today, because just knowing that it's a well-worn hat, there has got to be DNA all over. And like what the new sheriff has said too is that there's advancements in technology. They didn't have this touch DNA, this sweat DNA testing back in 93, but they have it in 2022. And I bet you that hat is sitting in the lab right now, probably close to an answer.
Yeah. I think outside of what we just talked about where, okay, it was somebody that they knew, and when you brought in the idea of maybe it being medication related, outside of that, the only other things that I have questions about that I would like to have looked into or to know a little bit more about was the relationship between David and Eddie prior to his death. What was Eddie into prior to his death? Was it truly just a car accident, or was there anything else around there? Was the grief that David suffered after his brother's death because he felt responsible for one reason or another? And then, I mean, they already ruled out Keith and Elizabeth, so.
I mean, to me, they didn't seem like there was any sort of involvement there anyway.
No, I wouldn't say it would be them. I would say, like, if they were into something, and this was a retribution style thing. Yeah,
which is just, it seems very far-fetched.
Right.
So since you've asked a couple questions, I have a couple.
Yeah.
And one really goes into like what kind of medications were the Johnsons taking? Were they taking things that someone would know about and they would want to take them, or maybe it was something that they were already addicted to and they needed more of it or whatever.
Yep.
So then my other question is, who took Mary to the grocery store on Friday night?
Yeah.
I want to know who that was. I want to know what they potentially saw, because who knows if maybe this person was even in the house.
I wonder if...
when Mary was coming home.
Well, if we're going down the rabbit hole of who took Mary to the supermarket, did she fill prescriptions at the supermarket?
That's an excellent question.
Just another idea to go along with your medication question.
Yeah, because those things used to all, I mean, I guess they still are. If you go to Stop and Shop, there's a pharmacy there, but I feel like that was like more prevalent in the 90s. It was like if you go to the grocery store, you'd be filling your prescription, you'd be getting your flowers for Mother's Day if you needed to grab a cake for a birthday, if you needed to get whatever. Like it's all in the grocery store. It's like a one-stop shop. Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good question that I forgot about, is who brought her to the supermarket.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I wonder if she told her brother, because her brother said that he was supposed to take her and then she got a ride from someone else.
Well, I would
Does
hope
no
so.
one know who took her?
I wonder if somebody did indeed bring her to the supermarket. If anybody there saw this person with her, if they just acted as a driver and then drove her back home.
Again, that could be like another witness statement that police are just waiting on, where it's like, who was she with? Honestly, potentially the night that she was killed.
Yeah.
So, I mean...
And that would work for the timeline, because if she goes to the supermarket later on, and then we're thinking that they were all murdered Friday night or Saturday morning, most likely Friday night.
Friday night feels more accurate to me, but...
Right, because she never contacted Maddie.
Yeah, which was a normal thing. Like if she had gone to the grocery store, come home, she probably would have made that call.
Yeah.
And set that up for the following morning. So you have to think, if she's not doing that regularly scheduled thing and she's someone who's got stickability,
right,
then that makes sense to the timeline of her and all of them potentially having been killed on the Friday night.
Yeah, I think this is, like you said, this is one that's very close to being solved. Probably just a few people coming in and giving a statement.
Yep.
And I'm very interested to know where it goes, or when they call in a suspect or when they charge a suspect. I'll be interested to know who it was, because there's no motive.
Yeah.
At this point, it doesn't seem. And all the people that we know seem to have been ruled out. So who are these other people that are kind of lurking, in the shadows that police haven't named, but they have their eye on?
Yeah, exactly. I would love to know that too. And I've got my Google alerts on, which I'm sure I'm going to get 500,000 emails on, because Mary Thomas and David Johnson are are very common names. So it was a little interesting to try and weed through stuff during research too. But do you have any other questions?
No, I don't think I do. I think this is one that you kind of have to speculate a little bit more without a whole lot to go on.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but there's good info to be able to use to then kind of theorize and speculate on what could have happened.
Yeah, the only thing that popped back in my head that I want to know is, was the FBI ever called in to create a profile?
Yeah, I'd like to know that too. That's a good question.
And if not, can they still be?
Probably.
Yeah.
It's been nearly 30 years since Mary Thomas and David Johnson were killed, and there has to be someone out there that knows something. Sheriff Wright stated, quote, "I want you to really dig down in your memory bank. If you saw something that you might not have felt was significant, tell us anyway," end quote. And I want you to take what he said to heart. There could be something so small that that could break this case wide open. Like I said earlier, authorities have physical evidence to test, but that doesn't mean that the case can be closed with just that. Authorities have stated publicly that they need you, the public, the people of Clifton, the people of Spartanburg County, to come forward with anything you know to put the monster that killed the Johnsons behind bars. Their family hasn't felt any sort of justice for 3 decades, and they deserve answers. Mary and Thomas's great niece stated, quote, "I watched so many of my family members pass away, and I watched them on a daily basis wonder and pray that they would find out what happened. There is somebody out there that knows something. There has to be." If you know anything about who killed Mary Thomas and David Johnson, please contact Diane Lestage with the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Department by email at dlestage, DLESTAGE, at spartanburgcounty.org, or you can contact her by phone at 864-503-4556. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.